I said poor people were lazy, until one saved my family's life. The courtroom air hung thick and stagnant, a suffocating blend of old wood polish and the faint metallic tang of fear. Sunlight, strained through the tall, grimy windows, cast weak, dusty shafts across the worn oak benches. I sat there, a knot of cold dread tightening in my gut, the weight of my own arrogance pressing down on me like a physical force. My name is Elias Thorne, and I was on trial. Not for a crime of malice, but for a crime of profound, unthinking cruelty. My crime was judgment, swift and absolute, a judgment delivered with the dismissive sneer of privilege. I had called them lazy, the people who lived on the other side of the tracks, the ones whose struggles I had never bothered to understand, never even bothered to see. Their plight, their very existence was a mere inconvenience, a backdrop to my own carefully curated life. I saw their circumstances not as a testament to systemic failure or sheer bad luck, but as a personal failing, a lack of will, a deficiency of character. It was a convenient narrative, one that absolved me of any responsibility, any need to look beyond the gilded cage of my own comfort. My world was one of polished mahogany, hushed boardrooms, and the satisfying click of a deal closed. Their world, as I imagined it, was one of squalor, of broken dreams, of a pervasive, self-inflicted inertia. The gulf between us, I believed, was not one of circumstance, but of inherent worth. The catalyst for this descent into my own courtroom of shame was a personal tragedy, a financial implosion that ripped through my carefully constructed edifice of success like a hurricane. My business, my reputation, my very security crumbled into dust, leaving me exposed, vulnerable, and utterly alone. In my desperation, I found myself seeking help, a concept so alien to my nature that the mere act felt like a betrayal of my own fabricated strength. I was forced to navigate the very streets I had so readily condemned, to interact with the people I had so easily dismissed. It was in this crucible of my own making, stripped bare of my defenses, that the first cracks in my hardened shell began to appear. I saw faces etched with a weariness that had nothing to do with laziness, hands calloused by labor that was anything but idle. I heard stories of resilience, of quiet dignity, of a persistent, unyielding hope that defied the bleakness of their reality. These were not the caricatures I had painted in my mind. They were human beings, flawed and complex, yet possessed of a strength I had never even begun to comprehend. The specific legal entanglement that brought me here, to this hushed chamber of reckoning, stemmed from a dispute over a property I had been forced to abandon. It was a bitter, protracted battle, fueled by my residual anger and my inability to accept defeat. I had accused the occupants, a family struggling to make ends meet, of exploiting my misfortune, of opportunistically seizing what was mine. My arguments, laced with the venom of my ingrained prejudice, painted them as parasites, as the embodiment of the very idleness I so despised. I saw their fight for survival as a calculated attempt to defraud me, a continuation of their perceived moral bankruptcy. The legal proceedings that followed were a blur of accusations and counter-accusations, a public dissection of my character and my deeply held, yet demonstrably false, beliefs. Each day in that courtroom chipped away at the facade I had so carefully maintained, revealing the hollowness at its core. The gravity of my words, the tangible harm they inflicted, began to dawn on me with a chilling clarity. I was not just fighting for a piece of property. I was fighting against the truth, a truth that was slowly, inexorably, beginning to reveal itself. The judge's gaze, usually a stern but impartial force, seemed to hold a flicker of something more, a quiet disappointment that cut deeper than any legal reprimand. The air crackled not with legal jargon, but with the unspoken weight of moral consequence. The turning point arrived not with a thunderclap, but with the quiet, unassuming presence of a man named Samuel. He was one of the occupants of the property I had so vehemently claimed, a man whose quiet dignity had been a constant, unnerving presence throughout the trial. His eyes, deep and knowing, had always held a certain sadness, but also an unwavering strength. I had dismissed him as just another one of them, another face in the crowd of the undeserving. But one evening, as the legal battle reached its fever pitch, a fire broke out in my hastily rented apartment. Smoke filled the narrow stairwell, alarms blared, and panic seized me. I was trapped, disoriented, the flames licking at the edges of my vision. It was in that terrifying chaos, that primal struggle for survival, that Samuel appeared. He was not the lazy, shiftless individual I had so readily condemned. He was a rescuer, a beacon of calm in the inferno. Without a word, he moved with an urgent, practiced grace, guiding me through the choking smoke, his strong hands steadying me, pulling me towards the life-saving embrace of the night air. He didn't hesitate, didn't question, didn't judge. He simply acted, his courage a stark, blinding contrast to my own paralyzing fear. In that moment, the carefully constructed walls of my prejudice didn't just crack. They disintegrated, leaving me exposed to the raw, undeniable truth of his humanity. The Medal of Honor, the symbol of his own past valor, hung not on his chest, but in the quiet, unwavering resolve of his actions that night. It was a medal far more profound than any I had ever seen, a testament to a character I had been blind to, a character that had just saved my life. The courtroom, with its pronouncements of guilt and innocence, suddenly felt distant, irrelevant, a mere echo of a life I was no longer living. The aftermath of that night was a silence so profound, it was deafening. The fire had consumed not just my possessions, but the very foundations of my flawed perspective. Samuel had pulled me from the flames, but he had also pulled me from the suffocating grip of my own ignorance. The legal battle became a distant, almost absurd memory. The property dispute, the accusations, the pronouncements of guilt, they all dissolved in the face of a life saved, a debt that could never be repaid with money or legal maneuvering. I sought him out, not with apologies, which felt utterly inadequate, but with a quiet gratitude that was raw and overwhelming. He accepted my unspoken thanks with a gentle nod, his eyes still holding that same deep, knowing sadness, but now also a quiet understanding. We sat on a park bench, the city's cacophony a muted hum around us, and for the first time, I saw him not as a symbol of my past failures, but as a man who had faced hardship with a grace I could only aspire to, a man whose inherent worth I had so carelessly denied. He spoke little, his words measured and thoughtful, but his presence was a lesson in itself. He didn't preach, didn't condemn, didn't offer platitudes. He simply existed, a living testament to the power of quiet strength and unwavering compassion. The Medal of Honor, a symbol of his service, was never mentioned, but it was there, woven into the fabric of his being, in the way he carried himself, in the steady gaze that saw beyond superficial judgments. The trial, the judge, the courtroom, they all faded into insignificance. What remained was the searing clarity of that night, the smell of smoke, the feel of Samuel's firm grip, the overwhelming realization of my own blindness. My family, who had endured my arrogance and my struggles with a quiet stoicism, saw the change in me. It wasn't a dramatic transformation, but a subtle shift, a softening of the edges, a newfound humility. The harsh judgments I had once so readily dispensed were replaced by a quiet curiosity, a willingness to listen, to understand. The world, once a series of categories and labels, began to reveal itself in its infinite complexity, its shades of gray, its unexpected depths. I learned that true strength wasn't in judgment, but in empathy. It wasn't in holding on to what was mine, but in recognizing the shared humanity that bound us all. The Medal of Honor, I understood, wasn't just a piece of metal. It was a symbol of a life lived with purpose, a life dedicated to service, a life that saw the inherent value in every soul, regardless of circumstance. It was a lesson I had been too proud, too blind to learn until the flames forced me to see. The weight of my past pronouncements still lingered, a quiet echo in the chambers of my memory. But it was no longer a source of shame, but of a profound, ongoing lesson. I had looked into the face of my own prejudice, and had seen not weakness, but resilience. I had been judged by the system, but saved by a man I had judged. The courtroom had been a stage for my downfall, but the fire, and the man who pulled me from it, had been my true awakening. The air now felt different, lighter, filled not with the stale scent of regret, but with the promise of a future where understanding, not judgment, would guide my steps. The judge's gavel fell, not on a verdict, but on a silenced past. The weight of that shared silence with Samuel, sitting on the worn park bench, was a tangible entity, far more profound than any courtroom pronouncement. It was in that quiet space, bathed in the fading afternoon light, that the true reckoning began. My initial gratitude, raw and overwhelming, had been merely the first tremor. Now, a deeper, more unsettling understanding began to surface, like a submerged truth breaking the water's surface. I realized that my prior act of seeking help had been born not of genuine humility, but of pure, unadulterated self-preservation, the desperation to salvage my own crumbling world, not a burgeoning empathy for others, had driven me to Samuel's doorstep, metaphorically speaking. This realization was a bitter pill to swallow. It exposed a layer of self-deception I hadn't even known existed within me. My perceived vulnerability was, in truth, just another facet of my ingrained self-interest. Furthermore, the act of rescue itself, while undeniably life-saving, had also, in a twisted way, reinforced my previous flawed perception of him. I had seen him as a hero, an extraordinary individual stepping outside his supposed limitations to perform an act of selfless valor. This, too, was a form of judgment, albeit a more favorable one. It still categorized him, placed him on a pedestal, and by doing so, subtly distanced him from the everyday struggles of his community, the very struggles I had once so readily dismissed. He wasn't just a rescuer. He was a man deeply embedded in the fabric of that community, a man who understood its pulse, its rhythms, its quiet triumphs and persistent challenges. Now, consider how this applies when you face a situation where someone extends a kindness to you. Do you see it as an isolated act of benevolence, or as a glimpse into a more complex, interconnected reality? My own experience underscored the danger of reducing individuals to singular, heroic moments, thereby overlooking the sustained, often unseen efforts that define their true character. Consequently, the true ethical awakening wasn't merely about recognizing my past prejudice. It was about dismantling the very framework that allowed such prejudice to flourish. It demanded a fundamental reevaluation of how I perceived worth, how I measured contribution, and how I understood the intricate tapestry of human experience. Samuel's quiet demeanor, his measured words, and the unspoken wisdom in his gaze began to reveal a different kind of strength, one that wasn't about grand gestures or public accolades, but about quiet perseverance, unwavering integrity, and a deep-seated connection to his fellow human beings. His presence on that bench was a living embodiment of a philosophy I had never encountered, a philosophy rooted not in individual achievement, but in collective well-being and mutual support. The Medal of Honor, I was beginning to grasp, was not merely a recognition of past bravery, but a symbol of a lifelong commitment to a higher calling, a commitment that extended far beyond the battlefield and into the quiet, everyday battles of life. Conversely, my own previous attempts at seeking assistance had been transactional, focused on what I could gain, on how quickly I could restore my own equilibrium. Samuel's approach, as I slowly began to understand, was relational. His actions stemmed not from a desire for personal gain or recognition, but from an intrinsic understanding of shared responsibility. He didn't rescue me for a reward. He rescued me because it was the right thing to do, a natural extension of his inherent character. This distinction was crucial. It highlighted the difference between a calculated act of self-interest, disguised as altruism, and a genuine outpouring of compassion, born from a place of deep-seated empathy. The subtle nuances of his interactions, the way he listened more than he spoke, the quiet nods of understanding. These were not mere mannerisms, but profound indicators of a moral compass finely tuned to the needs of others. Another crucial layer to this unfolding revelation was the realization that my own fall from grace had in fact been a necessary precursor to genuine growth. The loss of my wealth, my status, and my carefully constructed identity had stripped away the insulating layers of privilege that had shielded me from the realities of others. It had forced me, albeit unwillingly, into a position of vulnerability, a state that paradoxically opened my eyes to the resilience and inherent dignity of those I had previously disdained. The fire, and Samuel's intervention served as the dramatic punctuation mark on this forced re-education. It was the moment when abstract understanding coalesced into visceral, undeniable truth. Now, consider how this applies when you face a significant setback. Does it harden you, or does it, like my experience, create the necessary space for a profound shift in perspective, allowing you to see the world and your place within it with newfound clarity? The courtroom drama, once the epicenter of my world, was now relegated to the periphery, a stark reminder of the superficial battles I had been fighting, while the real war for my soul was being waged in the quiet spaces between moments of shared humanity. The courtroom's quiet gravity had dissolved, replaced by the persistent hum of the city and the more intimate, resonant silence shared with Samuel. It wasn't just the physical act of rescue that had reshaped my understanding. It was the profound, unspoken wisdom emanating from his very being that truly began to dismantle the remnants of my arrogance. My initial gratitude, I now saw, had been a shallow thing, a transactional acknowledgement of a debt owed. It was rooted in my own need to feel absolved, to quickly re-establish a sense of moral equilibrium for myself. This self-serving impulse, I realized, was a subtle but potent continuation of my old ways, a superficial gloss over a deeply ingrained self-absorption. Samuel, in his quietude, offered a stark, almost uncomfortable counterpoint to this transactional mindset. His actions were not about balancing ledgers or settling scores. They were about an intrinsic, almost elemental response to suffering. Furthermore, my tendency to view his rescue as an extraordinary act, a deviation from his presumed norm, was itself a form of prejudice. By labeling him a hero in that moment, I was still confining him within a predefined box, a box that conveniently excused me from acknowledging the consistent, everyday acts of compassion and resilience that likely formed the true bedrock of his character. It was easier, in a way, to see him as a singular, exceptional figure than to confront the possibility that such profound decency was not an anomaly, but a fundamental aspect of his lived experience, and perhaps of the community he belonged to. Now, consider how this applies when you witness an act of unexpected kindness. Do you immediately categorize the person as an anomaly, or do you pause to consider the consistent patterns of behavior that might inform such an action? This shift in perspective, from viewing his act as an exception to understanding it as an expression of enduring character, was a critical step in my own ethical evolution. Building on this, the very nature of my own fall became a subject of deeper introspection. The financial ruin, which I had perceived as a catastrophic personal failure, was, in retrospect, a necessary unburdening. The loss of my material wealth had, in essence, shed the thick, insulating layers of privilege that had previously rendered me oblivious to the realities faced by so many. It was this forced stripping away of my external markers of success that created the fertile ground for genuine empathy to take root. The fire and Samuel's intervention acted not as the seed of this change, but as the catalyst that brought it to fruition, transforming abstract awareness into a deeply felt, embodied understanding. It was the visceral experience of helplessness, coupled with the profound act of being saved by someone I had actively, albeit silently, condemned, that shattered the illusions I had clung to for so long. Conversely, my initial approach to seeking help had been entirely self-centered. I had reached out not from a place of genuine humility or a desire for connection, but from a primal instinct for survival, a desperate attempt to salvage my own precarious existence. This self-preservation, I now recognized, was a far cry from the selfless courage Samuel embodied. His act was not about personal gain, or even about the immediate alleviation of my suffering. It was about an inherent commitment to human well-being, a principle that transcended individual circumstances. Now, consider how this applies when you find yourself in a position of need. Is your focus solely on your own predicament, or can you see the broader tapestry of human connection and shared responsibility that your situation touches upon? The quiet dignity with which Samuel carried himself, the subtle grace in his every movement, began to reveal a different kind of strength. one that was not performative or self-aggrandizing, but deeply rooted in an unwavering moral compass and an innate understanding of shared humanity. The courtroom's hushed stillness, once a symbol of my impending judgment, now felt like a vast, echoing void where my old certainties had been systematically dismantled. Samuel's act of rescue, while undeniably life-saving, had also served to highlight a subtler, more insidious form of my own moral failing, the tendency to compartmentalize human worth. I had, in my previous narrative, framed his intervention as an act of heroism that transcended his circumstances. This framing, however, still implicitly suggested a hierarchy, a notion that his ordinary life was somehow less significant than this extraordinary act. It was a dangerous distinction, one that allowed me to maintain a subtle distance, to acknowledge his goodness without fully integrating its implications into my own worldview. Now, I began to grasp that true empathy demanded not just recognizing moments of exceptional virtue, but appreciating the consistent, often unseen, threads of dignity and resilience that weave through everyday existence. It required seeing the inherent value in the quiet persistence, the daily struggles, the small acts of kindness that formed the true fabric of a life, rather than focusing solely on singular dramatic events. Furthermore, the very act of my seeking aid, so thoroughly examined in the preceding section, revealed another layer of my deeply ingrained self-centeredness. My desperation was not a nascent desire for connection, but a raw, unadulterated drive for self-preservation. This realization was profoundly humbling. It exposed how my previous interactions, even those that appeared altruistic on the surface, were often colored by an underlying calculus of personal benefit. Samuel's actions, conversely, were unburdened by such calculations. His intervention was a pure expression of his character, a response driven by an unshakable moral imperative that transcended any consideration of personal cost or reward. Now, consider how this applies when you offer assistance to someone. Is your motivation rooted in a genuine desire to alleviate suffering, or is it perhaps subtly influenced by the expectation of gratitude or the desire to feel morally superior? The distinction, though fine, is paramount in discerning true compassion from calculated benevolence. Another crucial layer to this unfolding revelation was the understanding that my own perceived fall had been a necessary catalyst for genuine growth. The financial ruin, which I had initially viewed as an unmitigated disaster, was, in retrospect, a form of liberation. It had stripped away the superficial markers of my privilege, those insulating layers that had previously shielded me from the stark realities of others' lives. This forced shedding of my external identity created the fertile ground upon which true empathy could finally take root. The fire, and Samuel's decisive intervention, acted not as the initial planting of this seed, but as the crucial catalyst that brought it to fruition, transforming abstract intellectual understanding into a deeply felt, embodied truth. It was the visceral experience of helplessness, juxtaposed with the profound act of being saved by an individual I had previously, albeit silently, dismissed, that irrevocably shattered the illusions I had so carefully constructed around myself. Conversely, my prior attempts at seeking help were entirely transactional, driven by the need to regain what I had lost, to mend my own fractured world. This self-focused approach stood in stark contrast to Samuel's innate understanding of interconnectedness. His response was not about rectifying my personal misfortune, but about upholding a fundamental human principle: the inherent worth and dignity of every individual. It was a principle that seemed to guide his actions not just in moments of crisis, but in the quiet, unassuming rhythm of his everyday life. Now consider how this applies when you find yourself in a position of vulnerability. Does your focus remain solely on your immediate predicament, or can you perceive the broader network of human connection and shared responsibility that your situation touches upon? The quiet strength that Samuel exuded was not a product of grand pronouncements or public displays of virtue, but a testament to a deeply ingrained moral compass, one that guided him through the complexities of life with an unwavering sense of purpose and a profound respect for the shared human experience. The weight of Samuel's quiet presence on that park bench felt heavier than any legal verdict. My gratitude, initially a torrent of self-congratulatory relief, had begun to recede, revealing the shallow, self-serving bedrock upon which it had been built. I had wanted absolution, a swift return to my former standing, and Samuel's heroism had, for a fleeting moment, seemed like the perfect, convenient narrative to facilitate that. It allowed me to acknowledge a debt without truly confronting the systemic inequities that had shaped both his life and mine. Now, the uncomfortable truth emerged. My seeking of help was not a nascent step toward empathy, but a desperate clawing for self-preservation. A desperate attempt to reclaim the status I had lost. This self-deception, I realized, was a more insidious flaw than my initial prejudice. It was a calculated manipulation of my own narrative. Building on this, the very notion of Samuel's heroism began to feel problematic. By elevating his act to an extraordinary event, I was subtly reinforcing the very hierarchy I was beginning to dismantle. It implied that such acts were exceptions, not the rule, and that the everyday resilience of his community was somehow less significant. This perspective allowed me to maintain a comfortable distance, to admire his virtue without truly grappling with the societal structures that had forged it. True ethical growth, I was starting to understand, lay not in marveling at isolated acts of exceptionalism, but in recognizing the consistent, often invisible currents of strength and dignity that sustained individuals and communities through daily life. It was in appreciating the quiet perseverance, the shared burdens, the unwavering support networks that functioned far beyond the glare of public recognition. Furthermore, the dismantling of my own privileged worldview was not simply a matter of losing material wealth, but of shedding a deeply ingrained perceptual framework. The financial ruin had acted as a forced divestment, not just of assets, but of the very lens through which I viewed the world. This lens had previously filtered out the inconvenient truths of inequality, rendering them invisible or dismissible. The subsequent clarity, though painful, was essential. It allowed me to see the intricate, often invisible systems that perpetuated hardship, and more importantly, to recognize the profound strength and resourcefulness that arose in response to those very challenges. Now, consider how this applies when you experience a significant personal setback. Does it harden you into further self-protection? Or does it, like my experience, create the necessary space for a profound shift in perspective, allowing you to see the world and your place within it, with newfound clarity and humility? The courtroom's pronouncements faded into irrelevance, overshadowed by the stark, undeniable reality of my own profound ignorance. Conversely, my initial impulse to seek assistance had been entirely transactional, driven by a desperate need to regain what I had lost, to restore my own fractured narrative. This self-centered motivation stood in stark contrast to the uncalculating nature of Samuel's intervention. His act was not about rectifying my personal misfortune, but about upholding a fundamental human principle, the inherent worth and dignity of every individual, regardless of circumstance. It was a principle that seemed to guide his actions not just in moments of crisis, but in the quiet, unassuming rhythm of his everyday life, a life I had previously failed to truly see. The subtle nuances of his interactions, the genuine warmth in his gaze, spoke volumes more than any spoken apology ever could. The courtroom's hushed stillness, once a symbol of my impending judgment, now felt like a vast, echoing void, where my old certainties had been systematically dismantled. Samuel's act of rescue, while undeniably life-saving, had also served to highlight a subtler, more insidious form of my own moral failing, the tendency to compartmentalize human worth. I had, in my previous narrative, framed his intervention as an act of heroism that transcended his circumstances. This framing, however, still implicitly suggested a hierarchy, a notion that his ordinary life was somehow less significant than this extraordinary act. It was a dangerous distinction, one that allowed me to maintain a subtle distance, to acknowledge his goodness without fully integrating its implications into my own worldview. Now, I began to grasp that true empathy demanded not just recognizing moments of exceptional virtue, but appreciating the consistent, often invisible threads of dignity and resilience that weave through everyday existence. It required seeing the inherent value in the quiet persistence, the daily struggles, the small acts of kindness that form the true fabric of a life, rather than focusing solely on singular dramatic events. Building on this, the very notion of Samuel's heroism began to feel problematic. By elevating his act to an extraordinary event, I was subtly reinforcing the very hierarchy I was beginning to dismantle. It implied that such acts were exceptions, not the rule, and that the everyday resilience of his community was somehow less significant. This perspective allowed me to maintain a comfortable distance, to admire his virtue without truly grappling with the societal structures that had forged it. True ethical growth, I was starting to understand, lay not in marveling at isolated acts of exceptionalism, but in recognizing the consistent, often invisible currents of strength and dignity that sustained individuals and communities through daily life. It was in appreciating the quiet perseverance, the shared burdens, the unwavering support networks that functioned far beyond the glare of public recognition. Furthermore, the dismantling of my own privileged worldview was not simply a matter of losing material wealth, but of shedding a deeply ingrained perceptual framework. The financial ruin had acted as a forced divestment, not just of assets, but of the very lens through which I viewed the world. This lens had previously filtered out the inconvenient truths of inequality, rendering them invisible or dismissible. The subsequent clarity, though painful, was essential. It allowed me to see the intricate, often invisible, systems that perpetuated hardship, and more importantly, to recognize the profound strength and resourcefulness that arose in response to those very challenges. Now consider how this applies when you experience a significant personal setback. Does it harden you into further self-protection? Or does it, like my experience, create the necessary space for a profound shift in perspective, allowing you to see the world and your place within it with newfound clarity and humility? The courtroom's pronouncements faded into irrelevance, overshadowed by the stark, undeniable reality of my own profound ignorance. Conversely, my initial impulse to seek assistance had been entirely transactional, driven by a desperate need to regain what I had lost, to restore my own fractured narrative. This self-centered motivation stood in stark contrast to the uncalculating nature of Samuel's intervention. His act was not about rectifying my personal misfortune, but about upholding a fundamental human principle: the inherent worth and dignity of every individual, regardless of circumstance. It was a principle that seemed to guide his actions, not just in moments of crisis, but in the quiet, unassuming rhythm of his everyday life, a life I had previously failed to truly see. The subtle nuances of his interactions, the genuine warmth in his gaze, spoke volumes more than any spoken apology ever could. The most profound insight, the one that continues to echo long after the smoke has cleared, is that true transformation is not about erasing the past, but about integrating its lessons into a more compassionate present. It is about recognizing that the judgments we cast outward often reveal more about our own internal landscapes than about the individuals we judge. Samuel's quiet grace didn't just save my life, it illuminated the path towards saving my own humanity.